Dear colleagues and friends, we're starting a very important session this morning, and our speaker is Mary Robinson. I'll give you a brief introduction, but let me start by saying that when we began the competition for hosting ESOF 4 years ago, I recruited a panel of patrons. We didn't ask them to do very much other than to lend the distinction of their names to the enterprise we were undertaking. And Mary Robinson was one of the first I asked, and certainly the first to agree. So Mary, even though she hasn't been here through every twist of the road from there to here, she has been with us in spirit and was very instrumental in helping us to win the right to host ESOF. So we owe her a debt of gratitude for that. By way of introduction, for those of you from abroad, Mary Robinson was President of Ireland from 1990 to 97. From there, she went straight to New York as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, post she held for 5 years with great effectiveness. And in fact, fairly recently, you may have noted that she was honored by the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama for her work in that area. She's also locally still the Chancellor of our main university here in Dublin, Trinity College, University of Dublin. But she didn't retire after all that effort. She set up a foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, and I think that's a very courageous and visionary post to take, and to take on the responsibility of developing in that area. And as you hear her speak, you'll know why. But I do want to say that throughout her career, Mary Robinson, from the very beginning, and she's a lawyer by training, has been a very consistent campaigner for human rights, and particularly for women's rights in this country. And it's no exaggeration to say that much of the advances that we've had from the 60s on through in the progress of women's rights in society have been largely due to her efforts. So, Mary, you're more than welcome, and I hand over to you.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to join with President Higgins and others in warmly welcoming you all here to Dublin, particularly those who've travelled from outside Ireland to come for the Euroscience Open Forum 2012. It's great to see such an impressive gathering of scientists from around the world coming to Ireland's capital city. When Professor Paddy Cunningham approached me to become a patron and mentioned that Seamus Heaney was also becoming a patron, I wondered, were there any scientists on this panel of patrons? But there were, of course. The one thing I did say was that I hoped that ESOC 2012 would put some focus on women in science and gender. So I was very pleased to see that already earlier this morning there was a session on gender and the role of female researchers. So congratulations not only on that, but it's great the way that a rather small team under Professor Paddy Cunningham have been able to bring this important gathering of scientists to Dublin. And my task today is to join my world of human rights and development with your world of science, all in pursuit of an equitable and effective solution to one of the greatest threats to humanity, climate change. I'm really glad to see that there are quite a number of young people here. I think I'm going to be particularly appealing to the younger generation of scientists in what I'm saying. And given the company I'm in, let me start with some science. But I'm not going to do it in a very technical way with PowerPoint, etc. I'm just going to talk at you and to you, and then later you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions if you wish at the end. But it's a kind of conversation, but it's a conversation I've been reflecting on a lot since I returned to Ireland and established the Foundation on Climate Justice. For me, science is the essence of the human story. Each time we pose a question about how something works, why something is the way it is, why we are the way we are, the search for the answer translates into scientific endeavor and discovery. Science is the systematic resolution of questions through the study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world, through observation, experiment, and theory. Science has been and continues to be a key tool in human development. It brings us knowledge and understanding. It tells us about the universe and about ourselves. It explains how the world works. It divines the rules that govern the universe and the subatomic structures that we are part of and which are part of us. Last week's news from CERN on the search for the Higgs boson is a great example of how humanity seeks answers to really profound and difficult questions. I had an opportunity to visit CERN just over a year ago at the earlier stages in this search. I didn't fully understand how it was all going to work out, but I do understand the excitement that the scientists in CERN are now sharing. Science is fundamental to the technologies that have become essential to our lives, from the car to the mobile phone and the microwave oven to the solar panels. Scientific endeavor improves the quality of our lives. Science also helps to keep us alive. It tells us how we work, biologically, psychologically, and behaviorally. And it provides medicines to cure us and to enable us to live longer. But the fruits of scientific endeavor need to be used wisely. Our ingenuity gives us the power to save or to destroy lives, ecosystems, and ultimately the planet itself. Nuclear bombs, biological weapons, and military drones demonstrate all too clearly the deadly capacity of scientific discovery when used to wage war and claim power. Climate change encompasses both our capacity to understand the Earth and how it works, and to set limits on its capacity to provide the natural resources we rely on for our survival. Science explains why the planet we live on is the Goldilocks planet of the solar system. It's not too hot or too cold, but just right for us. Not alone to survive, but also to thrive and develop. And ever since the great Irish scientist John Tyndall set out to understand why the Earth was about 30 degrees warmer than the physics of the time would suggest, back in the 1860s, and discovered the role of what we now call greenhouse gases, we have been increasing our understanding of atmosphere and its role on our climate. The science of climate change is a great human triumph of profound understanding. It combines knowledge of the fundamental properties of atoms and molecules and their interactions with light to vastly complex processes by which the atmosphere, oceans, and vast land masses interact to produce our Goldilocks planet. Our understanding of climate science stretches from the days of Tyndall to the current work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Just as Tyndall was acknowledged for his work during his lifetime, with many scientific honours and appointment to the post of Superintendent of the Royal Institution, so the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2009. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a body of science and scientists that, over decades, contributed to our understanding of the climate system and of man's influence on it. It's now acknowledged that we humans are having such a profound impact on the planet that we may be moving from the Holocene, the warm and stable 10,000-year period during which life on Earth has flourished, to what Paul Crutzen has called the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch, where we human beings constitute a major force of change of the planetary scale. This is a cause of reflection. Through various sciences, we know that the Earth has gone through many eras, many changes. These are driven over hundreds of thousands of years by cycles of the precession of the Earth around the great movement of tectonic plates over geological timescales. Now we are or are becoming a driver of Earth's climate system. and therefore changing the destiny of humanity, not over thousands of years, but over a mere century or two. The ways in which we humans are stretching the Earth and its atmosphere to their limits has been captured in the concept of planetary boundaries. I like this way of describing the many complex issues involved because it's easy to understand and communicate, even to a non-scientist like myself. In 2009, the Stockholm Resilience Centre brought together leading scientists who proposed a set of 9 critical Earth system processes with tipping points, which, if crossed, would lead to irreversible or even abrupt environmental change. To reduce the risk of crossing these thresholds, it's necessary to determine safe boundaries for each of the 9 Earth system processes. If we stay within these boundaries, we're operating in a safe space for humanity. Climate change is one of the 9 critical Earth system processes, and estimates are that we have already crossed the planetary boundary, exposing the planet and its human population to significant risk. Research also indicates that we've crossed the planetary boundaries for biodiversity loss and nitrogen use, with freshwater, land, and phosphorus use rapidly progressing towards their boundaries. This presents us with serious challenges. We are on a course which we have set that puts us at risk, and as yet, we haven't been able to take the decisive action needed to change course, despite being presented with solid scientific evidence. Clearly, we're in a dilemma. What do we need to do to convince governments, corporations, institutions, and individuals to show leadership and embrace real change? Perhaps some of the problem is the challenge of communicating science. However, since Tyndall himself, we've had scientists who were accomplished communicators, and in addition, we now have television, newspaper graphics, computer graphics, and animation, all of which help science to have a broad reach. Perhaps it's the fact that solving the climate problem is not just a question of science, but of politics, ethics, and economics. While science helps us to understand the causes of the problem, and indeed the scale of the response needed to avoid dangerous climate change, it alone will not create the momentum and leadership we need to act decisively and stay within the Earth's safe operating space for humanity. It's in this context that I've become an advocate of climate justice. Climate justice is a human rights-based approach to combating climate change, which seeks equitable outcomes to both protect the vulnerable and provide access to benefits arising from our transition to low-carbon development. Climate change has a focus on people. It looks at the causes and impacts and the solutions to the problem from a human perspective. Climate justice is fully informed by science, but it communicates and identifies solutions from the perspective of human needs and rights. As such, it seeks equity. Equity in the way in which we respond to climate change, so that we take action to avoid dangerous climate change, while at the same time working to improve the lives of the poor and vulnerable who have yet to reach their development goals. I was given a beautiful book recently called The Human Quest: Prospering Within Planetary Boundaries by Johan Rockström, which speaks very much to climate justice. In it, Rockström says, and I quote, "Humanity has a moral responsibility to maintain a habitable planet over the centuries, not to say millennia. Given that we have entered the Anthropocene and we humans are the ones in control, the moral responsibility we have to current and future generations is greater than it has ever been in the past. The choices we make today about how we generate and use energy, or how we use our land for food, will determine the future of humanity on Earth. If we decide on a pathway that leads us to emit fossil fuel carbon to the atmosphere, as we have been, we are committing a serious injustice to future generations. Global emissions of carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas, increased by 5% in 2010, catastrophic for future generations, but equally indicative of gross inequalities among current generations. These emissions benefited those living in developed and emerging economies, while those in the least developed countries largely failed to benefit from the wealth generated from them. We live in a global society, a society with gross inequalities between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. In fact, power now resides with different actors than in the past, particularly with large international corporations, who often own more natural resources than governments, yet who are outside the international negotiations on climate change. Globalization describes not just our social and economic models, but also our environment. Never before were our actions locally so significant globally, and this should be driving us to reconnect our societies with our development and with our environment, as climate justice demands. Finding a solution to the climate crisis is proving difficult. The strides we made in Durban last December at COP17, where the global community agreed to develop a new legal instrument for all countries by 2015, have been challenged. Some countries are stepping back from this commitment, with concerns about the level of ambition needed to close the emissions gap and questions about who should act, by how much, and when. At the crux of the discussions are fundamental issues of equity. How can we support the right to development of developing countries while taking meaningful action on emissions reductions? Can we find ways to share the burden of reducing greenhouse gas emissions equitably? Are we focused enough on sharing the benefits of low-carbon, climate-resilient development equitably? Countries are guided in their deliberations on these questions by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle stems from the Rio Declaration in 1992, and it's enshrined, as many of you know, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The principle is central to climate justice, as it recognizes that developed countries are more responsible for the causes of climate change than developing countries. Their industrialization, based on the consumption of fossil fuels, put the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are causing global warming. This means that developed countries should act first to reduce emissions. Of course, emerging countries like China, India, and Brazil have significant emissions and capabilities, but historic responsibility for the bulk of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rests with the major developed countries, and we look to them for leadership. The principle also recognizes differences in capacity to address the problem. Those countries that are richer tend to have more skills, technology, and resources with which to control emissions, and are committed under the Convention to supporting those countries with less capacity to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities should facilitate the translation into practice of equity through the decisions taken by the UNFCCC and implemented by countries on the ground. However, current interpretations of the principle are diverse and divisive, leading to the question, and it's a serious question, is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities encouraging us to act or holding us back? Difficulties associated with putting into principle this practice means that it is used as a political pawn in negotiations, and in some cases is being used as an excuse for inaction rather than a motivator for action. Such is the level of contention that in the Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio last month, which I attended and I'm sure many of you were at, the principle almost disappeared entirely from the text. This would have been a serious setback and signals again the fundamental importance of equity in our work, to define safe planetary boundaries and the policies needed to keep us within the safe operating space for humanity. It's clearer than ever before that we won't solve the climate conference without addressing issues of equity. Science has a key role to play in providing the information needed to measure emissions, to determine safe limits, to raise the alarm when vulnerable people and ecosystems are at risk, and to define metrics and indicators against which to measure progress. Yet science alone cannot find an equitable solution, other factors inevitably have an influence, including human rights and politics. We have experience in translating climate science into information for policy making through the work of the IPCC. It works in a unique manner in that leading scientists work in essentially a voluntary manner to compile the reports which are subject to global peer review processes. Finally, its outputs are subject to scrutiny by world governments to inform policy. For example, it wasn't the IPCC that said that keeping the global temperature increase below a certain level, say 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, relative to pre-industrial temperatures, would prevent dangerous climate change. It wasn't the IPCC. It presented the scientific evidence, and it was world governments gathered in Cancun in 2010 who took the decision on what constituted a safe level of temperature increases. It was this political assessment of the science that was endorsed by all the parties to the UNFCCC in Cancun at COP16 in 2010. The most effective climate policies are informed by science and respond to science. However, to be equitable, climate policy also has to address issues of equity, morality, and human rights. We live on a planet with finite resources and a rapidly growing population. There will be, it's estimated, 9 billion people living on the Earth in 2050. Providing the food, water, and energy to meet their needs in a climate-constrained world will require great human resourcefulness and ingenuity. It will also require fairness and a global approach to a global problem. We need to take bold decisions now so that by 2050 we are firmly on a path to inclusive, equitable, low-carbon development, where the burdens and benefits of the transition to a new green development pathway are shared equitably, and the poor and vulnerable are both protected and enabled to live a better life. I quite often remind myself that 2050 is coming ever closer, that my 4 grandchildren, the eldest of whom is 8, will be in their 40s. For those of you who are younger and have children, they too will perhaps be in their 40s or early 50s. It's a world that is very close now, and yet we're not prepared for it. Theoretically, it may be easier to combat climate change without considerations of equity, but only if we were in a laboratory and not on a planet that is home to billions of people. In a laboratory, we could perhaps work only with the major emitters to secure a deal to reduce emissions, but this wouldn't address the needs of those vulnerable communities that are already feeling the impacts of climate change. Any solution to climate change has to be based on the realities of the global society we live in and the limits of the planet to sustain us all. Oxfam's donut paper presents a framework for this reality, combining the concept of planetary boundaries with social boundaries to create a safe and just space for humanity. And I understand that President Higgins last night spoke quite a bit about the social sciences and their importance, and I agree with him in that. This approach hinges on equity within and between countries to protect human rights while managing natural resources equitably and sustainably. This framework challenges us to keep all people free from hunger and poverty and empowered with rights and resources to live in dignity, while at the same time respecting and living within planetary boundaries. And this is very much in keeping with climate justice, informed as it is by science and human rights. I believe the time has come for a different narrative about climate change, a climate justice narrative, a narrative that places people at its center, that is informed by human rights, that strives for equity, and that protects the most vulnerable. We need a new set of arguments and moral and ethical imperatives to motivate people and decision makers to act, and to bring the urgency and ambition required to agree a new climate agreement that will avoid dangerous climate change. Until there's a greater demand by millions of people in all walks of life for meaningful action on climate change, political leaders will continue to be able to return home from unsuccessful climate conferences with very little fear of retribution, very little fear of paying a political price. That's one of the problems at the moment. Those who come back, the delegates who come back from these conferences, aren't challenged by their populations. What were you doing? How could you not have had more of an agreement? Take the Rio +20 agreement, a very weak text, a terrible abrogation of responsibility. Here was an opportunity 20 years after Rio to really change course, and yet the political will was not there to do it. And eventually a weak text with some possibilities, the Sustainable Development Goals and the possibility of a political forum, a high-level political forum on sustainability, but nothing of the leadership that we would need in order to really change course and address the urgency of the problem. I really do feel that most of all we need to take on board the urgency that I sense when I talk to those already affected by climate change. When I talk to my friend Constance O'Kellett in northern Uganda, who grew up in a village where they had seasons and they knew when to sow and when to harvest. And now they have long periods of drought followed by flash flooding that have destroyed the school. And she's brought together a group of women to try and address that situation. And they have no plan B, they have no insurance. And every year it's getting worse, so that livelihoods have been destroyed. And that's a story right across the African continent. When I was in Bangladesh, I saw the impact of the brackish water on livelihoods, fishermen and women trying to fish in a different way, trying to grow crops in the brackish water, trying to learn new ways to adapt. My friend Ursula from the Cataract Islands is relocating her 1,500 population to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. She's negotiating for land, but her greatest sadness is that they are leaving the place of the bones of their ancestors. And that for an indigenous people is incredibly tough and incredibly painful. But all of those people have a sense of urgency because their lives and their livelihoods are threatened. If we can have that sense, if we can have a climate justice narrative informed by the voices of the most vulnerable, we can create strong constituencies of demand and the political will needed to solve the climate crisis. In the coming 3 years, we have a window of opportunity to develop a strong climate justice narrative to complement the latest climate science that will be presented in the 5th assessment report. It's only by responding to science and protecting people's human rights that an effective and equitable deal can be done to avoid dangerous climate change. At times it seems that we've gone so far down this destructive path that change on the scale we need is almost impossible. But we also know that we're capable of achieving as human beings, when we want to, anything when we're convinced of the need to act. For some reason, despite all the scientific evidence, some people still need to be convinced. And of course, there are powerful lobbies that are fostering climate skepticism. And the role of the climate justice dialogue is to facilitate discussions around the world that bring people together, allow them to talk and to be listened to, and to create new constituencies demanding action of their leaders. At the same time, we can use the principles of climate justice to inform discussions on equity in the climate change negotiations, so that the agreement reached in 2015 is effective and equitable. And how will we know it's equitable? The ultimate indicator of success will be a climate regime that prevents dangerous climate change, protects the most vulnerable, and allows equitable access to the benefits of a new low-carbon society. Clearly, you, scientists, must be key actors in this climate justice dialogue, informing, challenging, and finding solutions. As scientists, you're the world's barometer, early warning system, and emergency response. But to translate this knowledge into action requires policy, and to do so equitably requires global cooperation and a commitment to human rights. Some things you might consider as scientists, research funders, and policymakers are, firstly, creating platforms to enable climate scientists to work with social scientists and development and human rights practitioners to design equitable solutions to climate change. We have good working examples of this approach in the International Human Dimensions Programme on Global Environmental Change, founded by the International Council on Science, ICSU, and the International Social Science Council, ISC, in 1996, and the more recent Coalition on Human Rights and Science, established by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, launched in 2009. I actually had a small role to play in being with AAAS at the beginning of 2009, after the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I was very pleased to see so many distinguished scientists saying, we need to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has to guide our work, it has to be our value system. And that I found very encouraging. It's important that research funding is designed to correspond to and catalyse these multi- and interdisciplinary approaches. There are real opportunities for this to inform European Union research funding, in particular Horizon 2020. So that's my first point, the need for these platforms that connect the different perspectives. And secondly, returning to the idea of a high-level representative or ombudsperson for future generations, as was discussed but unfortunately not adopted in the context of Rio+20. Someone who would act independently to provide assessments of the adequacy of policy in responding to science and safeguarding the rights of future generations. John Tyndall allows us to claim the origins of climate science here in Ireland. A century and a half later, we understand a great deal more about the atmosphere, the role of greenhouse gases, and the impacts of human activity is having on the global climate. However, we need to take a leaf from John Tyndall's book and continue to debate, to question, and to challenge beliefs and vested interests in our efforts to combat climate change. We also need to communicate, to motivate, and to create demand for change. Demand from ordinary people, men, women, and children around the world for change, for a safe planet, and for an equitable global society. All of these elements are interlinked. We cannot do one without the other, hence we cannot work separately. Climate justice acts as a bridge between rights and science, and between people and planet. It's not one or the other, it must be both. And the path we take must be safe for both. We missed an opportunity in Rio last month to embrace a new development paradigm, directed and led by governments. Instead, there's a mood coming out of Rio that I think very many of us share. And that mood is we have to move forward more urgently than that framework has offered us. And there are a number of governments and a number of political leaders who also share this belief. So what we need is governments that are willing to move forward much more seriously, and alliances with civil society in its broadest sense, with business, with philanthropy, and of course with the scientific community, in what we might call coalitions of the committed, for vision, leadership, and hope. So I say to you, and again, I come back particularly to the young scientists among you, don't be afraid to lead. This is a really unique time in human experience, when the responsibility, the moral responsibility, has never been greater. So don't be afraid to lead, to hold governments to account, and to defend the vulnerable. That is what we need, and we need to do it together, scientists and non-scientists. And that's why I'm so committed to climate justice. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Call to action.
Dear colleagues and friends, I suppose the most relevant thing to say is that the issues addressed by Mary Robinson is probably the most important interface between science and society today. It's certainly the most global, long-term, effective one, but it's one on which those of us on the science side of that barrier between science and politics feel impotent very often We can pursue our science and we issue our reports and they find their way into the newspapers sometimes, and the world seems to go on ignoring that. So it's a very important area, I think, and Mary Robinson has not alone been an active proponent of solutions there, but has with both, I should say, passion and compassion addressed the issues in a very effective way. So this issue is open for discussion now. We have perhaps 15 minutes for discussion, and we can take a first question here. There are roving mics, I do believe. Do we have a mic? I think it'd be better if you could be heard. Okay, please shout.
Hear the voice of skeptics more loud, because what you presented is not yet a political problem. This is still a scientific issue, because neither the increase of CO2 due to human activity is proven correctly and reliably, nor the danger of CO2, because CO2 participate in a very complicated balance. It gives life to trees, to plants, and so on. I will not go to the details scientific, I will follow your example. So I will make a number of statements. By the way, I am a theoretical physicist. I am flanked with experts in astrophysics, in cosmic rays physics, in cosmology. At least I interviewed personally maybe 30 well-known scientists on the level of a member of Russian Academy of Science, Israeli Academy of Science. I was unable to find a single person who really believes that human activity determines the situation will probable increase of CO2. The warming, which stopped around 2010 actually, has a number of explanations. And the cycles of temperature, you can follow not 100, but 1,000 years back in time. And you will see these variations.
You got the message.
So to orient all people that by concentrating on decreasing CO2, you can help in Cambodia people not to starve. It is not only naive a little bit, but it is dangerous. So what I would say, what is necessary to investigate the problem, when the problem will be investigated, we will need help of politicians, of humanities. At this point, not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Another question on the second row back there, if you can bring a mic there, please. The danger of delay is the problem there, isn't it? No, up here. They're behind the camera. Thank you.
Yes, José van Eindhoven from the Netherlands. I'm having a remark and a question because I think indeed that climate justice is a very important issue, but it's also in climate or in the people connected to climate science in the broader sense, a very underdeveloped narrative. I was at Planet Under Pressure in London 3 months ago, and well, it was not, well, sometimes there was something about justice, but not very much. So that's an underdeveloped part. And also in UNESCO, for instance, COMEST, on ethical issues, it tried to set up something on climate and ethics, which is directed at justice. But also the EU did not want to be involved in that. So my question would be, well, for the scientists, I think it's the challenge is how to integrate more with the people part. But my question to you is, well, for the politics, how to address politics with respect to this issue. It's already difficult with respect to the technical issues, but, well, that's something that's going on for a long time already. But how to connect to this part of the issue as well within science and the humanities as to politics?
Do you want to take the questions
okay.
as they come? Or
I can take those two, and then maybe if there are two more. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll respond to the first two questions, and then there may be a couple more. To the physicist who asked the first question, I do respect your scientific knowledge and approach, and I'm not going to be able, as a non-scientist, to really debate with you on that basis. But that's precisely why we need a climate justice approach, because we need to know the impact that changes are taking place around the vulnerable parts of the world, which also happen to be the poorest parts, which have not been contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And that, I think, is why I've come to climate justice. I come from a human rights perspective. And so I would answer you in a completely different way. I would say that I had an opportunity of listening to 5 African farmers in a kind of tribunal that Oxfam organized, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu and myself were sitting listening to these 5 African farmers. And understandably, 4 of them were women, because most of the farming in Africa is done by women. And one after the other, they told about how they were deeply affected by the changes that were taking place. There was a rooibos farmer from South Africa, and she had a good but low income from her rooibos tea farming, but now she couldn't do it in the part of South Africa she was living in because the weather had changed so much. And then there was the only man was a pastoralist from Kenya, and because of the drought, he was in great difficulty. And my friend Constance O'Kellet from northern Uganda told her story, and there was a woman from Mali and from Malawi. And at the end of it, I responded partly to kind of lighten the mood a little bit, because it was very grim to hear their stories. I said, well, I come from the west of Ireland, and my father was a doctor there, and I used to go out on calls with him. And my experience is that farmers always complain about the weather. Is that what you're doing? Complaining about bad weather, like farmers always do. And it was Constance who responded to me. And she said, with a lot of dignity, she said, this is outside our experience. And that kind of affected me, because in a village like that, she comes from, that would probably span about 200 years. Grandparent to grandchildren to grandchildren, if things had changed as dramatically as she was talking about. And so I think what we need to know is that we have a world with a very rapidly growing population, but in the poorest parts of it, there is a huge stress that people cannot cope with because they're not climate resilient, because they don't have insurance, they don't have a plan B. And that's the climate justice approach. It's for the scientists, and my understanding is the vast majority of scientists do accept the reports of the IPCC. But if I can come to the second question, I very much agree with what you said about climate justice being, and I quote you, a very underdeveloped narrative. And that's partly why I'm so interested in it, because we do need to make these connections, but we need to do it as thoroughly as we can. And I'm glad to say that my foundation has just concluded an agreement with the World Resources Institute in Washington. And we're going to help to foster a climate justice and climate equity narrative over the next few years, and then we'll produce a flagship report. We will have a lot of regional partners in different regions of the world and open up a discussion, because the problem is, as I tried to indicate, the developed countries don't want to talk about common but differentiated responsibilities at the moment. They just don't want to open up that space. But we will not get the agreement that was promised at the Durban COP17 last December, that all countries would agree to a legal agreement by 2015, unless we talk about equity. Politically, it's just not possible. So we want to have the perspectives of what African countries and their political leaders think about common but differentiated responsibilities. That's never been opened up as a real discussion. India, China, Brazil, but also small islands, indigenous peoples. This is a debate we need to have if we're going to move forward on climate. And that is really what we mean by that narrative about climate justice and equity.
One more question here.
Hi, Rohit Talwar from Fast Future in London. You made the point that we require a more demanding citizenry if we're going to hold politicians to account and get them to take action. We're starting to see some of that happen in the UK now around things like banking reform. What do you think it's going to take to help raise public awareness further and encourage them to take the same kind of action that we're seeing in other areas?
May I take a second question here? I see that. No,
Let us take the three.
Okay.
My name is Ray Bates. I'm an Irish climate modeler, and I'd like just to comment on what the theoretical physicist who spoke at the beginning said. I'm sorry I didn't pick up your name because the microphone wasn't working. But all the climate models that are in operation today predict quite significant temperature rises in the future if CO2 emissions are not checked. And while the models we can't be absolutely certain that they're not false in the models. Nevertheless, there is a huge risk of very serious consequences if we don't act to limit CO2 emissions. So I would say that on the basis of risk of long-term, very serious danger to the planet, we must act now. Thank you.
We'll take a third question here. Front row.
My name is Leah Ash. I'm with a research network called Pure Food around urban food sustainability and security. One of the permutations of climate justice is that of food justice. And the human right to food is an approach that's been embraced fairly enthusiastically by a number of countries in the South, in particular in South America. But it hasn't been as widely embraced by rich countries in the North, particularly the United States. And I was wondering if you could comment on how you see that narrative, the human right to food, or the human rights narrative in general, as one that can be made compelling to rich countries of the North. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again for very interesting questions, and I'm grateful to Ray Bates for his comment, which I don't need to come back to. The first question really was one that I'm very aware of and interested in, and that is what does it take to raise consciousness and make this an issue that is taken on urgently by people, and therefore politicians will give the leadership that we need. There was a lot of discussion about that in Rio Plus 20. I actually helped to facilitate, together with a good friend of mine, Jay Naidu from South Africa, a meeting of some of the very large NGOs between Oxfam, Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, Third World Network, saying there's been too much divide, even in the civil society approach. What are the issues that we essentially agree upon, and can we be more effective? And also a very strong feeling that there's a sort of climate NGOs bubble and an environment NGOs bubble, and that actually it's not getting out to wider social movements, trade union, though the trade union was strongly represented in Rio, and they were part of this discussion. So I think my sense was that all of those who came to Rio Plus 20 last month, hoping that there would be a recognition of the need for a real change, that this was a once-in-a-generation moment for change, and who were so frustrated, didn't come away deflated, but came away with a sense we've got to find ways of building these coalitions of the committed to move forward, because time is running out, because there's such a high risk, because of the impact that this is having around the world. And that maybe brings me to the question about the right to food and food justice. Obviously, I strongly support the Special Rapporteur on right to food and look at this very much from a human rights perspective. I've also been asked to be on the lead group of the Scale Up Nutrition, and I've been able to encourage a very strong gender dimension in the Scale Up Nutrition. We now have a subgroup on both gender and the gender implications of food and nutrition, but also women's leadership and women's engagement on that. I think that there are very strong movements, as you said, about where food is grown from. I think we will increasingly see that there will need to be a climate label, a climate footprint label on how food is produced and where it's produced from, and this will certainly help that notion of having as much food as possible grown locally, and helping to support the capacity for food and nutrition. I've just literally come from South Sudan. It was my first visit there. I was there with two other elders, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the former president of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari. South Sudan was just about to mark its first year of independence. There were a lot of problems with the north. There was fighting in South Kordofan and Blue Nile. We went to see a refugee camp, etc. But the thing that most disturbed us, I think, was to see rich agricultural land, huge potential, but not being farmed to produce food for the local population. A sense that such was the sort of background of war for so long, that the people themselves are not focused on their own food production. They're in a dependency on NGOs, on the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme at the moment feeds more than 1.1 million in South Sudan, and estimates that during the hunger months that are coming up now with the rainy season, that they may have to feed 4.7 million, which is half the population of South Sudan. There's a need to reorient to food resilience and food justice, as you say, in that broad sense. And I'm glad that the Irish government next April will be hosting a conference on food, nutrition, climate justice, which my foundation is also involved in, together with the World Food Programme and CIGIAR. And we hope to put that focus on the importance of the human right to food linked with nutrition and climate justice.
I think since we're at 10:30, we must draw the discussion to a close. Let me just comment on two small points. One was this idea that Mary has referred to about labeling food. That's a first step. It's a small part of the total, but in the exhibition hall downstairs, you'll find a stand about agriculture in this country. And one of the initiatives here is to now put a carbon footprint on all beef production in this country, because we export 80% of our beef. So in a very small way, there's something of interest beginning there. But the second is that I would encourage you to Google the Foundation for Climate Justice that Mary Robinson has established, and you will find there an opportunity perhaps of engaging, an instrument that you can use to engage as scientists in this interface between science and politics. So I would like to thank Mary for a very stirring and informative and indeed provocative challenge to us all as scientists, to encourage her in her work, and to thank her very much, and to thank you for your attention.
Right. Thank you.